Hello, everyone. First of all, congrats to the organizers, because I've been here at this conference. Is the first edition, and I've seen it growing year after year. It's so cool. Second thing, my talk was supposed to be called setState demystified, but it didn't fit very well in this first slide, so this is more minimal, more cool, and I called it setState for the win, but the content is the same, I promise. My name is Michele, and I talk about React every day, at least once a day since 3 years now. And I work at Facebook. I work in the ads organization. I built React components for pretty sophisticated React UI. And who knows about setState? Who uses setState here? Okay, not everyone, so that's cool. So setState is the primary method you use to update your UI in React. So if your UI is dynamic, you should care about it. And for those who know what setState is, they may wonder, are we really talking about setState for 40 minutes? And the answer is yes. I wrote a book, 300 pages book about React, and I could talk about setState for hours. You can find me talk about setState later at the happy hour as well. But I understand why this guy came from London, England, to talk about setState at the React conference in 2017. That sounds weird, right? But I have a reason why. This is a real comment from a real community. I'm learning React, but I don't understand reducers. And for those who don't know what reducers are, they are a very powerful concept. They're a core concept of Redux. Redux is a state management library for React. It's great. And reducers are a way for you to define how your state changes according to an action that has been fired in the system. But reducers have nothing to do with React. So this is a huge problem. And when I started, there was only React, not even React DOM. And I used to use jQuery to do my asynchronous codes. But that's true. And because in the React documentation, they were saying you should use jQuery. And while now, if you start using React, if you go to an Italian community or an English community, or if you look into a boilerplate, you can find 50 dependencies just right away. You install a boilerplate, you have 50 dependencies for free. And you have to use, if you want to build a simple React application, if simple to-do list, you have to use Redux, right? And then you need React Redux to connect the two. And then you need a router. Everyone needs a router, and then you need React Router Redux to connect all of them. And then if you wanted to do, I don't know, an HTTP call, you need Redux Saga, and then you need the immutable.js, and so on and so forth. And actually, if you think about it, this looks like a Christmas tree, but it's not always Christmas. And okay. Okay, but let's see what the community thinks about setState. Let's start with Michael Jackson, the king of pop as well as the creator of React Router. He says nobody knows how to do anything without Redux anymore. It's ridiculous. And he trains a lot of React developers every day, and so he really knows how React developers feel. And if he thinks that, then I don't think it's ridiculous. Actually, it's a huge problem, and we should solve it. Then I was scrolling in my Twitter feed, and I've seen Michael is going to give a talk about MobX later with Mattia, and he says 3 reasons why I stopped using React setState. Oh my God! So I should not use it. And he has 3 reasons why he found that setState wasn't solving problems. Well, actually, was creating problems to him, and he created MobX. So that was great. Thanks setState. But then I was scrolling a little bit more, and I found Michael Chen says, I love setState. In 3 years and a half, I haven't needed anything more. And if I was just starting with the React, I would be a little bit confused by this. Should I use it? Shouldn't? I have no idea. And suppose I decide, okay, I'm going to go with Redux. And then Dan Abramov, the creator of Redux, write a blog post, you might not need Redux. So what should we do? I have no clue. And this might be pretty confusing for a person that is starting with React. So let's see what are the common pitfalls with setState. Why people think like setState can be a little bit tricky in the beginning, and they might choose to use, for example, Redux or MobX without using a local state. I'm going to start with like showing you like a little bit of some like problems or like pitfalls that you can have when you use setState. Suppose you have this code here. So you fire setState, you pass an object that has a title, here comes the sun, and then you console log this.state.title. If you suppose that the title hasn't been initialized, like can you guess like what this is going to log in the console? Yes. Because setState is asynchronous. But it's not so obvious for everyone, especially in the beginning. Second thing, what if you do this? You shouldn't, I mean, in general, you should not fire setState twice in the same event handler, for example. But suppose for some reason you have to do it, and you have a counter that depends on the counter value in the state. Suppose that the counter in the state has been initialized to 0. Like you might think that this is going to give you a value of 2 in the end, but actually this is going to happen. Your state changes are going to be put into a queue. So starting from the previous state, then the new state change, the second state change, and basically the last one is going to override the previous one. So you're going to have, the counter is going to be 1 if it was initialized to 0. And this is because multiple setState calls get batched. Cool. Another example. If you do this.state.title come together, you shouldn't do it. But if you do it, like what, do you know what happens in React? Like nothing actually happens in the UI, but the state is changed. So as soon as your React component is going to re-render for any reason, for example, because the props change, the new state is going to show up in the UI, and this is not expected. And obviously, you shouldn't do it because it is an anti-pattern. You are losing control over your state. React is losing control over your state. It's super, super bad. Last but not least, you initialize your state like this with a song object that has a title, let it be, and a year, 1970. What happens if you do this.setState and you pass a song with a title? You might expect that you're going to have the new title and the old year because the state is merged, but actually the state is just shallow merge. So the second song object is going to override the previous one. And this might be confusing in the beginning. So cool, so we've seen the problems. Let's now go quickly through what setState does for you, and then we're going to see how to use it properly and how to use it in cool ways. So first of all, you install setState. So right, yarn add setState. Don't try this at home. Actually, the setState package exists for real. It's a real thing. You can install it. It exports an empty object. And this was Michael Chan trying to say if setState was packaged out as a library, then people would love it. So it was like trying to convince people to use it. And this is pretty cool. I'm not sure if it worked, but yeah. And so setState enqueues changes to the component state. So it doesn't update your state. It just puts the new state changes into a queue. And if they would call it like schedule state, maybe that would be better, but this is what we have. And also it has React, that the component needs to be re-rendered with the new state. So you just put the state change in the queue, and then you tell React, whenever it's better for you, just re-render the component. And this is why I love React. Like you just tell React what you wanted to achieve, and then React is going to do the best. So it's going to, for example, to like batch state changes together. It's going to find the right DOM nodes to be updated, and so on. So thank you, React. And this is the signature of setState. Is you pass an updater function and an optional callback. Your updater function is going to receive the previous state and the current props, and you're going to return a state change. This is because setState is asynchronous, so you cannot assume that the props and this.props and this.state are up to date when you are firing the updater. There is also a second signature where you can pass the state changes right away, and this is perfectly fine if your state doesn't depend on the previous one. The optional callback is where you can access this.state and make sure that the value is updated. So if you console log this.state inside the callback, then you're going to have the current state. And this is a design decision. So because the React team, this setState is asynchronous, so this.setState is going to always hold the value that is rendered. So if you console log after this .setState, the component is not re-rendered yet, so this .state is going to have the previous value, because that's the value that is rendered at the moment in the screen. Cool. We're now seeing how setState works. Let's see some best practices, how to use it properly. So Dan Abramov tweeted this cheat sheet, which is awesome. Like, it explains like to decide what to put inside the state and what not. So it says, if you can calculate a value from the props, then don't put it in the state. If you are not using the value in the render method, don't put it in the state. Otherwise, just use it. A couple of examples. So in this case, we are initializing the state using the props, which is perfectly fine. It works. But this means that you have to keep the state and the props up to date, because if the props change, you have to keep them in sync. And there is no reason to do that. You just use the props in your render method. Then the second thing is, sometimes you want to save some information in the component instance. For example, an API subscription. And you might think, okay, the state is the right place to do it. But actually, the state is not used in the render method. And setState is going to re-render your component. So you're going to re-render your component for nothing. So you just attach the request to this.request, and it's done. Cool. We're now talking about more cool stuff. In a sec. Just one sec, sorry. Okay. So testing. Who loves to test their components? I see you. Okay. I love test my component. I really, really love to test my component. For those who know me, I'm a fanboy of Jest as well. And you might say, if I use Redux, if I use a state management library, testing my business logic is easier. While if I use setState, I get spaghetti code. And I cannot test it. And if you don't want spaghetti code, you just don't write spaghetti code. Like the library or the framework you're using has nothing to do with your spaghetti code. In fact, I'm going to show you that you can write cool and testable functions with setState as well. So let's suppose we have this setState here. So where we have an updater that receives the previous state and the props, and it calculates the value of the counter using the previous value of the counter and a step value that is passed by using the props. We are using, since we are using like values the new state depends on the previous state, we are using an updater function because we want the pre-state and the props to be up to date. Testing this, I agree, is not the easiest thing because you would use, I don't know, enzyme to fire the event handler where this setState call is, and then you would check that the component will render with the new state, for example, but that's not the best. You just want to test the updater. So what you can do is this. Look, just the first line change. So you extract your updater into a separate file, and now you have a testable function, right? And then you just import your updater function into your component, and you just do this.setState increment. First of all, the setState call becomes more readable, so because you can tell like this is gonna you can call it increment counter, whatever you want, and also you can separate your updater in a separate file. And if at some point you move to Redux, for example, you can reuse your updaters in your reducers, for example. And also, most important thing, we start from this, you can test your updaters. So you can set a previous state, some props, you just call the increment, and you check that the new state is the updated one. If you like snapshots, or if you have complex objects, you don't want to just copy-paste your state in the two equal matcher, you just use snapshot, which basically creates a snapshot of your object, and it tells you if something changes unexpectedly. Cool. So you can test using setState, you can write clean code. Cool. What about the separation of concern? I don't want to write to use setState because setState forces me to write the logic inside the component where also like the styling lives, and I want my concerns to be separated. There is a pattern called container and presentational. How many of you know about this pattern? Okay, you're gonna like it. If you don't know it, you're gonna really like it. So for each component, for each logical component that you write, for example, I don't know, user profile, you create two actual components, user profile container and user profile. And the container is gonna care about the data and the event handlers, and it doesn't know anything about how the component is gonna look like in the browser. And then you have the presentational component who cares about the appearance, so where you put the HTML and the style style components, inline style, whatever you want. Let's see an example of container. This is also called sometimes smart dumb pattern, but yeah, but it's the same thing. So this is a container component. So in the component itself, for example, you fire an HTTP request, and when the request succeeds, you set the state. You set the state of the container component. And then you pass down the state to the dumb component, to the presentational one, that doesn't know anything about the state. So the dumb component only receives props, and the container knows about like data fetching and event handlers. If you want to fire an action from your dumb component, again, your dumb component doesn't have to know anything about the action. You just pass down a callback. I would never call a function CB, but it was just to fit this code into a slide. Don't do that, please. So you pass down the callback and the state as well. So when for example, you can attach to an on-click in the dumb component. When the click is fired, the container callback is fired. For example, in this case, we do an HTTP post, and then when the call succeeds, we set the state in the container, and we pass down the state. So the dumb component only knows about props and callbacks. And this is great because, first of all, you can separate your concerns, and also you can work in parallel. So for example, like JavaScript developers can work on containers, like and using fake dumb components, like just to show random like data with random HTML elements. And then UI developers can write the presentational components. They can put them in the style guide using fake props and using, for example, console log as a callback just to see if it works. This is awesome. Then you connect the two, and it works. Cool. But most of the time, what you really want to do, and the reason why you use Redux, is doing data fetching, right? And to do data fetching, you need Redux, Redux Saga, and then you need, I don't know, reselect and normalizer as well, because you want to normalize your data, and so on and so forth. And if you have a form, you use Redux form and everything, whilst you just want to fetch some data, right? If you install this package like React Fetching, you can do data fetching in a declarative way. If data fetching is the only thing you want to do, this is the component for you. You can even use, for example, in your style guide, if you want to fetch some data for some components, you just plug in this, you set the URL of your HTTP request, and then in the OK props, you set the component that you want to be rendered when the call succeeds. And there is also a property for when the component is loading and for when there is an error. So this is pretty cool. If data fetching is what you want to do, this is for you. A second way to separate your concerns is composition, using higher order components. Even though there is a super cool talk by Michael Jackson, he did it recently at the React Boston, if I'm not wrong, and he says you would never write a higher order component again. But yeah, some higher order components already exist, so if you want to reuse them, it's good to know how they work. So a higher order component is a function that has this signature. So it receives a component, and it gives you back an enhanced component. For example, you can enhance a presentational component with data fetching functionalities. So you don't even have to write your containers. You just write your presentational component, and you use higher order components to give them data fetching functionality. There is also this second signature where you pass the options, you get back a function that takes a component and give you back another component. And if you want to do data fetching, but not only fetching, but also like posting data, this is the library for you. If this is your only need, you just need this. You use React Refetch by Heroku. It's a great library, and it gives you this higher order component, which is called connect. And the first option is map props to request, because your request might depend on the props. For example, you want to append the user ID, whatever, to the URL. And then you pass the component, which is going to be enhanced with these data fetching functionalities. This is an example. It looks like a little bit weird because, again, I tried to put it into a single slide. So the first part is where you define all of your calls. And it's basically an object where you have the keys that are identifiers for the call. In this case, we are calling F. And the second part is your component, which is going to receive the same identifier you passed as a property, and it has some special properties. For example, fulfilled. F.fulfilled means that the HTTP request has been fired, and you can access the value through the value. So in this case, we're going to print the name of the first beer returned from the Punk API. And this is pretty cool. You can also define the lazy, because this call is going to get fired in the component in map. But if you want to load data like lazily or like using an event handler, you can do that as well. So if data fetching is what you want, you don't need Redux, Redux trunk and all that kind of stuff. You can just use this, and you can be cool as well. But yeah, okay, this is cool, great. You are talking about this simple stuff. Like, so what about sharing state? Like, this is good for a to-do list, right? What if I tell you that you can share the state without using a state management library? How do you do that? This is a simple thing, like you lift your state up. And this is a pattern that always works with React. It's similar to the container and presentational, and I want to iterate twice on it because it's something you should really care about. Suppose the state lives in the bottom right component. Suppose you are building, for example, I don't know, a CMS. You have a list of users and the sidebar. And the bottom right component is a list of users that fetches the data, and the data lives in the state of that component. But you want its sibling to receive the data as well. For example, in the sidebar, you want to show the number of users you loaded, for example. How do you do that? You move the state up one level. You find the common ancestor between the two siblings. And at that point, when the state lives in the parent, both components can receive the data. I'm going to show you how to change a component to move the state to the parent. So this is the component on the bottom right. It does an API get, and then it sets its own state, and then it uses its state in the render. The state lives there, it's fine. But how do you put the data on the parent? You use a callback. So instead of setting the state, you pass down a callback, and when the callback is fired, it's going to do something in the parent component. And then instead of using the state in the render method, you're going to use the props. So this component doesn't have any state anymore. The parent, though, looks like this. You have this callback, which receives data, and it sets the state on the parent. At that point, the state is in the parent, and all its children can receive the data. Supposedly, you can pass down the state, the callback, to any children. And this is okay, great, okay, it's a good step, but what if my only common ancestor is the root component? Because this is what I wanted to tell you, like, real thing. Like, you're going to end up with a situation where you have a lot of components that blindly pass down like props and callbacks, but they don't do anything about that. So the only solution would be to use a global state or like a state management library. Nope. You can use React Broadcast. If the only thing you want is just to share the state between components in different parts of your tree that are not connected, you can use React Broadcast. You create a broadcast component wherever you want in your tree, even in the root. You define a channel, which defines is where the data is passed through, and then the value that you want to share between your components, and then you render the children. At any point within the tree, you create a subscriber component, which has the same channel string. You can have multiple channels, multiple broadcasters, multiple subscribers. And it receives the state, and you render the component using the state. So even if the components are not connected, this is going to solve the problem for you. And it uses the context, but in a very smart way. So even if you have pure components in the middle, this works. Cool. So far, so good. But I'm going to use a state management library because I can have like super cool debugging experience and time travel. You can have time travel experience with setState as well. And you install this library. It's called React Lumberjack, and it's highly experimental, but it's great to show you that you can do it even with setState. And when you install it, it logs all the state changes of all your components, which is similar to the Redux logger. And it gives you an object like Lumberjack where you can fire back and forward. So you can do time traveling within your component state as the same as you do with Redux, for example, Redux step 2. Cool. Last but not least, everyone is talking about functional programming. I want to be cool as well on Twitter. I want to say I write my reducers. I want to be like everyone else, right? But you can do it with setState as well. This part, if you don't know about like how Redux works, this part of the talk can be a little bit tricky to understand, but I'm more than happy like later to explain like how this works. I have an example of this working on concept box reach out to me. I'm very, very happy to show it, to show you how it works. But if you know Redux, it should be familiar. So if you add this method to your component, dispatch action, and then you set the state using a reducer that receives the previous state and the action, you basically have Redux pattern in a single component. This is a method that you add to a single component. And this is super simple. I was just trying like to do some experiments to say, because this reducing pattern with action is super, super cool, but Redux often require a lot of boilerplate. So I was trying to find an easy way to use this pattern, like avoiding writing a lot of code. And I found this library, like the T-Redux, is built by Emanuele. I cannot see him. He's a great developer. He's here. Reach out to him if you want to know more about this library. It's super cool. It's a lightweight version of Redux that you can add to your components and to use the same patterns of Redux, but in a very, very lightweight way. Let's see how it works. Again, this code might be a little bit tricky to understand if you don't know Redux, but I'm happy to explain it later. So you use a build reducer function. A reducer is basically an object that has the key, which is the type of the action that is fired in the system, and then you define the state change. In this case, we increment the count. Then we define an initial state, which is counter to 0, and then we have an increment function, which dispatches the increment action. So this might sound familiar if you know Redux. Then you define a button that receives the counter value from the state, and on click, it dispatches the action. And then you connect all together with the with state higher order component, to which you pass reducer, initial state, and then the component. If you use partial application, you can even apply the same state with the same reducers and action to more than one component, so they can even share the logic. And this is it. A quick recap. So we have seen the best practices. So don't calculate if you can derive. If you derive your state from the props, that's wrong. Don't put something that you don't need in the render method into the state. You can test your logic if you extract your updaters into a separate file. You can separate your concerns using the container and presentational pattern or composition. You can share the state, lifting your state up, or using a broadcast technique. You can do time travel as well, and you can write functional code. This should be fine, okay. What if at this point I figure out that this is not enough? So this is not, you are telling me to use setState, but I can see like this is not scaling for me. This is not enough. I need something more structured. Yes, it's exactly at that point that you should introduce a state management library. But at this point, you wouldn't say, I'm learning React, but I don't understand reducer, because React would be super clear for you. So problem solved. And also, if you've been yesterday at Francesco's workshop, you know how to use state management libraries. But to use state management libraries, you have to have some requirement. Obviously, if you know these things, if you and your team know these things, even before, like just by using React, these are very, very useful. But you have to keep in mind that if you introduce, for example, Redux Saga in your stack, then you have to know reducer. Even though a lot of us are using Redux Saga without having no idea how generators work, but someone in your team should know about that, because if you have a bug, that's gonna be a problem. So you should know like about immutability, pure function. So you are basically raising the bar to like enter your team or to start working with your project. So state management libraries are great. I always use that. So I suggest you to use Redux, MobX, whatever it fits and resolves your problem. They're awesome libraries, but yeah, just use them when you really need them. Like learn React first, and then at some point, it's going to happen. Like it happened to me, it happened to everyone. At some point, you're going to say, no, this is not going to scale. I need something else. And at that point is the right point to use the state management library. So make informed decisions, because you have to know what you're bringing. Because every time you bring a dependency into your component, into your application, your package.json, you own it. You cannot say like, okay, I'm importing it and that's it. You own it. You must be able to fix the issue. You have to maintain it. So think about it wisely. For example, and there are always trade-offs. Because for example, Redux is very verbose. So if you want to trade like verbosity for like cleanness of like writing reducers and action, that's perfectly fine. But you have to have a good reason for that. And also know your tools, because someone is telling me, like, I'm using Redux, so I don't use setState. But actually, Redux uses setState. This is an important thing to know, because if you have to debug something, you have to know that. MobX React uses force update because it's super optimized, and a force update is similar to setState in a sense that it re-renders the component, but without using the state, because MobX is taking care of the props and the state for you. Takeaways. Keep it simple, keep it super simple, learn React, have fun, don't feel overwhelmed, don't install 50 dependencies just because it's cool. Lift your state up. Most of the problems with React can be solved by moving the state up to one level. This is always true. Finally, have fun, because writing React code is super fun. There is no tension between Redux, MobX, setState. Use whatever solves your problem, and use whatever doesn't create any problem to you. And this is it. This is me. This is the book I wrote. Follow me on Twitter if you want to hear more about me. I'm going to post the slide afterwards. Please reach out to me. Ask me all the questions. I'm happy to show you how the functional dispatch works, and I want to learn more how you are using setState and everything. I hope you enjoyed this talk and the rest of the conference. Thank you.